Welcome to another Ideas That Matter conversation. And it's going to be a lot of conversation this time because I have as our guest Kolby Granville, who is the editor and founder of a different kind of conversation, one that's actually much bigger in scope called After Dinner Conversation. There's a podcast, there's a literary magazine. There's actually, if you go onto the site, you'll see a whole bunch of different features to it. And what we're going to talk about in particular is where it came from, but also the content of this magazine and community, because it's something pretty germane to those of us who are interested in philosophy. So, is there anything that you would like to highlight before? Because I only gave the briefest of a thumbnail sketch, Kolby, before we jump right into it.
No, I think you did a great job. So we publish short story literary fiction uh, that has an ethical and philosophical focus. So that's a lot of phrase for someone to wrap their head around. So the way I tend to say it is, if you've ever read The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, that's the kind of thing we would publish. Um, if you haven't read that, then my other example is The Trolley Problem. Imagine if Kurt Vonnegut wrote The Trolley Problem as a short story. That would be the kind of thing we would publish. And in fact, each of our stories actually come with 5 discussion questions because that's the point, right? The point is for it to be you to be actively engaged with the reading, and ideally either with yourself or with other people who've also done the readings. Um, that magazine has now turned into a little bit of syndication and other publications, as well as like a dozen books of anthologies and themed books wrapped around certain ideas for short stories, as well as 2 podcasts. One where we sort of model the discussions that we hope people are having. So
Hmm.
2 or 3 of us will read a story and just discuss it the way we hope you would discuss it. Maybe we come to different conclusions, but the idea of just sort of a respectful conversation around a table. Um, and then we also have audiobook readings of it, which is the other podcast.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. One of the things I wanted to jump in right away. So, ethics is clearly like the biggest field in philosophy that these stories are connected with. But there's, when we talk about speculative fiction or fiction even more broadly, even realistic fiction, there's, metaphysical themes or epistemological themes. You can think about detective novels as essentially being epistemologically driven, unless they're hard boiled, in which case there's some ethics and just some punching people involved. So what are the other areas that where there's questions that are being raised by the stories that you're soliciting and publishing?
For sure. That's a great question. So we talk about it being ethical and philosophical conversations because to a layperson, that's a sort of catchphrase. Under ethics is a word that
Mm,
any person on the street can sort of understand, right? Because their mom or dad has told them like be a good person. Um, but absolutely not. We publish a lot of philosophy that maybe isn't necessarily directly ethics. We publish quite a bit of metaphysics. We get a lot of utilitarianism
mm,
stuff. I mean, that's if you're not trained as a philosopher, utilitarianism is usually the first place that you think of. There's some medicine and only 5 people can get it, and there's 100
right.
people that are sick, sort of thing. But we'll take a lot of stuff. So yeah, I mean the whole gambit of things, everything. I've seen versions of the allegory of the cave. We've gotten that once or twice. I've seen we've published 2 or 3 versions of this idea of can God be both all good and all knowing and all powerful? We've published a couple versions of sort of I think, therefore I am. A lot of the times those are within the world of AI,
Okay.
which, from a fiction standpoint, AI very much lends itself to the sort of Descartesian uh, review, I guess you could say. Um, and I'll be the first to say that I am very much a person who's sort of 2 Venn diagrams, right?
Okay.
So one of my circles is very much literature and fiction, and another one of them is philosophy. But like everyone who does 2 things, I probably do neither expertly. Um, and so that's just life, right? Like that's
Yeah, that's the story of my career.
yeah. So you definitely so once in a while I'll talk to a really hardcore fiction person who's like, "Well, have you read this? Have you read this? Have you done this? Have you done?" And I'm just like, "Not exactly." And then once in a while I'll talk to a really hardcore, like we'll get an email from a philosophy professor at Oxford or something, and and there's citations and links, and I'm just like, okay, like I'm gonna need a minute. So yeah, so we run a very strange diagram of our overlap in that we don't exactly live in the literature fiction world. We don't exactly live in the philosophy world. We sort of straddle them, which makes for interesting grant applications.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that, literature has been used really, or literary approaches have been used since the beginnings of philosophy. You mentioned Plato's allegory of the cave. There's so many stories within Plato, maybe a little less so in Aristotle, though he references some, and, the Stoics, Cicero,
We get
people
a lot
like
of
that
Stoic
bring it up.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it extends to the present time. It's interesting too that you brought up like the issue of have you read this? Have you encountered this?
Mm,
Because I mean, it's probably even more so in the world of literature, but in the world of philosophy, I get people saying, hey, you should read this book, or you should check this person out, and I'll be like, first of all, I don't have the time. I'm
right.
I'm doing the stuff that I'm doing. Even with like the figures who I actually work on, they'll be like, "Did you read this secondary source?" And I'll be like, "I've never even heard of that person. I'm sure
Yeah.
they're perfectly nice and competent, but there's like 800 people writing on this person. I'm not going to read all of them because I'd prefer to read that actual thinker, whether it's
Yeah.
Descartes or Anselm or whoever." And there's this sense in which I think a lot of people outside of the field think, well, there's probably not that many books, when in
Oh
reality,
God.
even if you just like started, you put the cutoff as 1800, and you're only going to read stuff
Yeah.
going
It's a
backwards.
lifetime of books.
Yeah, you couldn't possibly exhaust all of that, even in Western philosophy. And then you bring in,
Right.
the whole Chinese cultural sphere, Indian cultural sphere, and there's like masses. And I think a lot of people get dismayed when they realize that. Like I actually had the experience as a grad student walking through a really good research library that I didn't realize was unusual in that respect at Southern Illinois University, and being in the philosophy stacks and like looking at all these books, piled up on shelves about 8 feet high, and thinking, oh, I'll never read all this, and I won't remember three-quarters of what I read, and then feeling a bit dismayed, right?
Well,
And
and also,
fortunately, I got over that.
and I
But
also feel in the case of philosophy, more so with fiction, philosophy is one of the only places where you can be like, yeah, I read for 2 hours today. What did you read? About
five
six
pages,
pages, right? And you're like, and I think I understand him now. Maybe I'm going to read him again tomorrow,
yeah,
right? And
that's.
so there's a
I
lot
mean,
of that that goes on. And then you pick up Harry Potter and you're like, I am a genius.
yeah.
Like I can read 100 pages an hour.
I mean, there's some literature, and I don't just mean like the stuff that we typically, laud as being modernist and difficult and all that, like James Joyce Ulysses.
Yeah. Oh,
There's a lot of authors who are, they read quick, but there's
mhm.
so much there.
Yeah.
Think about Ursula K. Le Guin.
Yep.
You
That's
brought
a
up
great
Homeless.
example.
Those Earthsea novels and short stories, they all fit into an omnibus that I think is around 1,100 pages or so, but you can keep going back to that. It's so incredibly rich what's happening there
Yeah.
that yeah. And as a matter of fact, let me get your take,
Yeah.
totally off topic.
That's okay.
So, as somebody who's invested in people reading attentively, there's a lot of I don't know how to describe them. There's a lot of like, let's call them hucksters out there
Okay.
that are preaching this. We're going to teach you how to speed read, we're going to read 100 books in 1 month, and
Yeah.
you're going to get so much out of it. My take on that is, well, that's, first of all, it can't work. You're going to miss 90% of what you're supposed to get, but this is actually producing bad habits for you. And I get the idea. The stories in After Dinner Conversation, none of them are like novella length, right? They're
No.
all
No.
short
Six, 7
stories.
thousand words is the most.
Yeah. So, but you do want people to read them attentively, not just skim for the main ideas so they can get to the
Yeah,
questions at the end and answer them. So what's the general approach? And what's your take on all of these people who are promising, "Oh, I'll make you such a great reader. You just got to like plow through it quickly and do whatever
sure.
techniques they have."
Sure. So there's a lot of questions in your question there. So give me a second. So the
Sure.
first thing I would say is, one of the things in education that has become very much in vogue in the last 5 or 10 years is this idea of close readings, right?
Right.
Where you don't just read something, but you think about it and you interact with it and you sort of get a better sense of like what are the implications of the reading, right? Um, I'm very much an advocate of close reading. I think one of the failings that people do in reading, but also in teaching, is mistaking coverage for learning. Like,
Yeah.
well, I
Yeah.
covered 37 units, so I'm the best teacher. I'm clearly better than a teacher who covered 30 units. And it's like, no, no, that's not really the way it works. And I feel like that's probably the same case with speed reading. Now, that said, there are certainly two kinds of reasons you read, right? Like if I'm reading a menu, I, I'm just
Yeah.
using technology to convey information. And if there is a tool or a technique that can convey that information quicker to me, what's the harm, right? Uh, I don't have any issue with that at all. Um, but in some reading is a menu, right? If you read
That's right.
some
Yeah.
books, there's a book for everybody, just like there's a TV show for everybody. There's the equivalent of, Survivor in books, or like Say Yes to the Dress. And then there's the equivalent of like The Good Place or, Game of Thrones or whatever, you consider to be higher brow um, TV. And I think that's appropriate, right? Like that's the way it should be. And so if you are reading things that are meant to be plot driven, if they're meant to be entertaining,
Hmm.
uh, then if you can read them faster, good luck to you, right? Like some bodice ripper, romance novel. If you're telling me that you're reading a 300-page book in an afternoon, I'd be like, cool by me. Like, what doesn't harm me? And that's you probably got everything out of it you were trying to get out of it. Um, but if you're trying to read something from after dinner conversation, uh, and I will say that our sort of meter goes back and forth from story to story, and that's not it's both intentional, but it's also serendipitous in that
Mm.
um, I feel like good writing is like 5% smarter than you are. Um,
Oh, okay.
and and if it's 20% smarter than you are, then it's kind of gibberish, right? And you might have to read it a lot. You might never get it. You might come back to it 5 years later when you're a little bit smarter. And then there's stuff that's, 20% dumber than you are, and you can read it as quick as you want.
Yeah.
And but of course, the difficulty with a literary magazine is if you're trying to come up with stuff that's about, you know, that's beyond where you are, but within your reach, sort of 5% smarter than you are, that's going to be a little different for every person. And
Right.
so
Right.
we will have stories where I'm like, is this like super hard and deep? No, but to someone it probably is. And it does the thing we're doing, and it creates a forum for these kind of discussions. And then we have a story. We haven't come a magazine that hasn't come out yet, but it came out. It's coming out in a month or two. And I do the little, intro to each issue, and I literally put in the issue like this is one to do with a highlighter. Like this is
Okay.
not a like just by luck of the draw, we've got 7 stories that are all tougher. Um, and so, don't feel like you have to read this in a sitting. Don't feel like you have to get it the first time. And we probably went, that's probably more than we should have done in one issue. We probably should split a little bit better, but just luck of the draw and what came in, that's how it worked out.
Do you get much feedback about particular issues from readers beyond just the
Sure.
like,
I loved it.
oh, it's so wonderful, I love this sort of thing, but like, sort of substantive, oh, this was a little bit too rich of a meal, or
Yeah.
you know,
So we don't get the too rich of a meal, but we do get feedback. We probably get half a dozen to 10 emails a month,
okay,
which which, sometimes I feel like, why don't we get more? And sometimes I'm just happy we get any. Um, the feedback that we get, the most common feedback we get, is number one, I read these with my kids as bedtime stories and we discuss
Oh,
them.
okay.
Or the other option that people say is I assign it to my kid, and so our bedtime story is not me reading it, but us discussing what they read before bed. That's probably the most common email we get. We probably get that email a couple times a month.
That's
Um,
very interesting. Do
which
you,
actually, which triggered, by the way, us putting trigger warnings or content warnings at the
okay.
top of each
Yeah,
story
yeah.
because we shoot for PG-13, and I'm getting emails from parents that are like, "Oh, my 10-year-old and I talk about these stories." But I'm like, "Look, that's you and your parenting style." But so now we actually started including content descriptions. I don't want to say warnings, but content descriptions before.
Yeah.
So that's the number one thing we get. The number two thing we get is from teachers in high school and college professors saying, "Can I get the rights to make Xerox copies of this story for my
Mm,
class?"
okay.
We get that a couple times a month as well. And we, of course, we always say yes because the mission is to spread this way to interact with media and the way to think. And so, from our standpoint, the money is the thing that allows us to do it. It's not the end goal. So, the more, one more example. Because we're just celebrating our 5-year anniversary, I pulled the numbers yesterday of how many short stories we've had downloaded on Amazon, either for free or for pay, how many sample magazines we've gotten from our website, how many Substack readers and all that, trying to figure out how many people have actually got the thing that we've done in the last 5 years. And we just passed over 250,000
Wow.
downloads. Yeah.
Congratulations. Yeah.
Yeah. I wish all those people were paying people, then we could actually pay our authors more. But yes, I was very excited.
You know, talking about those most common responses makes me wonder. So, you've talked about sort of like two types of audiences already. So, parents who are going to use these in some way with their kids, and then teachers, whether in, K through 12 or college, who are using them with students. What are the other main, it's not like you have just in business, sometimes they talk about who's your customer, who's your ideal
Oh, we think
avatar.
about that a
Well,
lot.
but you don't have just one, right? It's a segmented bunch. Who are the other main audience groups that you're aiming at, or that you've picked up in time and that was kind of a surprise to you?
Yeah, so that's also a really great question. So, not what I expected. So in
Hmm.
my mind, and this is just sort of the egotistical thing, is I was looking for versions of me, right? Other people who like what I like.
Yeah.
Um, and once we started doing surveys and digging into it, uh, we ended up with something a little bit different. So, about two-thirds of our readers are paid readers. I don't know about our unpaid readers.
Okay.
The ones who pay for subscriptions have at least a master's degree.
Hmm.
Um, and often that master's degree is in, um, I don't want to say a hard science, but it's not like a business degree.
Okay.
The most common things that we see are someone with a master's or a PhD in computer programming, physics, mathematics, economic theory, political theory, some philosophy people, some ethics associate professors. But you tend to be older and educated. Um, that's one big segment of what we get. The other segment is people who want to be published in literary magazines,
Okay.
right? So you're a writer and you're like, I want to become a published writer. First, you try to publish a book and you realize that nobody wants to see your manuscript and no agent wants to see it. And then online, you sort of learn about, like, oh, the first step is to get published in literary magazines. So you send something off to the New Yorker, not realizing the New Yorker doesn't really read its unsolicited
Right.
submission pile. And then eventually you stumble across some list of all the literary magazines, or you do a Google search or something,
Hmm.
and you find us. And you like, okay, I'll get published in after dinner conversation. And you email us something, and we go, this isn't really what we do. You need a little more time to develop as a writer. And they go, okay, well, how do I do that? And you go, well, one of the ways is you become a reader. Like
Right, right. Yeah, yeah.
if you need to read in order to write, even bad stuff, because that helps you understand what you don't want to do. And then those people who want to publish start subscribing to literary magazines, either ours or other ones. Um, and they usually will have, 2 to 3 to 5 subscriptions that they read a bit of, um, so that they can develop their craft and better understand the market to later become published in those magazines. That's probably 25% of the people that subscribe to our paid magazine. And I
Interesting.
don't think that's rare.
Yeah,
What doesn't exist, and I'll shut up. What
oh,
doesn't exist, which really surprised me, is just people who read. Like this market of just like my grandma or my buddy has a subscription to Plowshares,
yeah.
right? Which is a great literary magazine. They do something different than us, but they're a great literary magazine. That is very few people, right? If people read, um, they tend to read sort of popular fiction, on
Right,
the
right.
Oprah list or something like that. They don't necessarily, or in a best case scenario, they pick up a copy of the anthology Best American Short Stories 2024.
Okay.
It's a very long ways down the food chain for a reader to get to a literary magazine.
Do you think that's a more recent development, or because I think back to, I remember as a kid in the 80s reading Harlan Ellison. He had some essay where he was talking about how nobody buys books anymore, but that's not really that new. And then he was writing in the 70s saying something like 4% of people actually purchase books. Now, that doesn't mean they're not buying magazines, newspapers nowadays in our time, reading things online. Um, literary magazines, there's quite a few of them out there. Um,
Thousands.
but is the readership for them shrinking overall,
I
or
don't
aging?
I don't know because I've only been doing this for 5 years.
Okay.
But I can tell you what I've heard and what I've sort of inferred. And the answer is that it's becoming more as the costs. So let's say you were in the 1980s and you
Mm,
wanted to do a literary magazine or a
right.
magazine at all. You did a layout, you sent it to a printer, you did a run of probably thousands, and then you figured out how to sell them.
Yeah.
Um, and so the type of literary magazine that you could produce that even had a chance of getting rid of 1,000 copies or 2,500 copies for a print run, and the runs are probably even higher back then. That's tough, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So what does that magazine look like? Well, it looks like a lot of our legacy literary magazines. They publish short fiction, nonfiction, interviews, poetry, and reviews, book reviews, right?
Right. Right.
Because they need to sort of be for everyone, have a little of everything. Now you can put out a literary magazine for, if you know what you're doing, 25 hours of work, and less than $100, and you can ship it to anywhere in the world, and do it individual print runs, like print one at a
Right.
time as a print on demand.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that has allowed, which I think is a good thing, is so let's say that you're super into, LGBT people of color from Detroit, right?
That's
That's
getting
fine.
pretty specific. Yeah.
It's really specific, but that's fine, right? If that market for your magazine is 100 people, you could do a literary magazine for 100 people, right?
Right. Yeah.
Um, and so I think that the lowering costs have caused more literary magazines to exist and greater market segmentation to come about.
Okay, so there's more magazines out there chasing a slightly increased, but not, dramatically increased number of readers, and
I'm not
in
even sure
some
they're
respects
increased,
dollars.
but right. I mean, and this is sort of the get off my lawn old man thing, right? Is there's just so many things competing for your attention, whether
Right.
it's social media, whether it's reels, whether it's TikTok, whether it's television or cable television or YouTube or whatever. Um, and so I think people rightfully choose the media that suits their interest and also their academic level and also their attention span and time constraints, right?
Right,
Like I
right.
see in the back there, you've got a copy of Locke. Phenomenal. Uh, but that's a certain kind of person with a certain education level and a certain amount of time.
That one's actually a funny one because
Is that not Locke? Am I misreading it?
no, it
Oh,
is John Locke's essay. And I remember, so I was in a graduate level class on Locke with a great teacher who was super, super into him. And some of the students were complaining as we were reading this. They're like, this is really difficult stuff and
yeah, it is.
boring. And he was like, well, you got to remember that this is what counted as really good prose in the 17th century. They were expecting you to sit around and read the stuff for a while and think
Right.
about it.
Might
It
take you a month
wasn't
to read it.
exactly. Yeah. And so he had to give us this reminder in the 1990s. And this is to people who actually wanted to be in the
Right.
class. So imagine you handed that. So it's like I don't know, some college class, bunch of people who aren't interested in philosophy at all and have to take a philosophy class, and you put that in their hands, and not even the whole book, just like a couple chapters sort of. They'll be like, what the hell is this? And they're not likely to retain an awful lot unless somehow you make a connection,
Well,
you
but I
with
also
your
think here,
lecture.
so as a former teacher, I think this is one of my frustrations with teaching and our where our
Yeah.
education system is we hand a student a copy of John Locke or Great Expectations or Moby Dick or whatever, and we tell them this is books and this is as good as it gets. And 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 then you wonder why they never pick up a book again.
Yeah.
Like, and so imagine if somebody, I'll use the, because I think of movie examples too. Imagine if somebody took 2001, A Space Odyssey, and showed it to an 8-year-old and were like,
Well,
this is movies and
even sh-
this is as
e-
good as it gets. Like they'd never
even
watch the movie
showing
again.
that to me as a
Yeah.
teenager, 20 something, I was like, holy crap, is this boring? When is something going to happen?
Yeah, it's just
You
20
know?
minutes of him floating out into space.
Yeah, or the eye sequence where it's just a
Yeah.
bunch of different colors, and everyone was like, "Oh, it's such an amazing movie." I had a similar reaction to Citizen Kane too because it'd been
Right.
talked
It
up
may
so
be it
much.
may be great, but it's not good.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
unless something is adding to it, explaining and
Right.
unpacking it, right?
Well,
So, like with the teaching, I mean, that's part of what we do is if we want them to like Moby Dick, I mean, and that's a hard sell,
yeah.
given the many digressions in it. We've got to be able to like somehow connect that to their lives.
For sure, right? And that's the issue, and that's when I think, that this fiction that runs a middle ground. I think After Dinner Conversation is a good example
Yeah,
of that, where it's readable, but it also has something to discuss, right? There is something between John Locke
yeah.
and Harry Potter.
Now that in the back of my mind, something that I realized I want to ask you about. So there are these 5 questions for each of these stories. Who comes up with them? And is there like, I don't know, is there some sort of like framework or structure to how they're formulated? Because obviously you can't have like the same basic 5 questions each time. They've got to have some variety to them. But I mean, that's a lot of questions you're generating, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
how
Actually,
so how
I
does it
write them
come
all
about?
myself.
Oh, you do?
Yes, and I will tell you, it's the only part of the magazine that I refuse to give up to other people,
Okay.
because I really enjoy writing them. But it is a day. I mean, so even after the magazine's entirely assembled and done and finished, and I've got to write these questions, I will go through with a printout of the magazine and a highlighter, and I'll do just like you would do in an academic class, and I'll highlight it and jot notes and do the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I'll spend a good 6 or 7 hours um, generating the questions for each one because you're right, they can't repeat. And almost always there's a reason we picked that story, right?
Right, right.
And so but and this is the part where it gets tougher is you can't necessarily ask a question about the thing directly. So you can't so we'll use a really basic one. Let's say the allegory of the cave, since everyone has heard of that and knows the background of it. So if my first question was should they have left the cave, um you've sort of spent your whole thing on the first question. And the problem is with a question like that, good questions are very hard to write for teachers, but also for what we do. If that was your first question, the person wouldn't engage with the material. They would
Right,
just
right.
tell you their gut reaction. right? Like, well, of course I would because I'm brave. And so there, you're getting a lot of stupid stuff in there. And so instead, you have to ask a question that's something like, you know, do you think a person in the cave could independently realize they were in the cave? What
Right. Okay.
clues
Yeah.
might they
Yeah.
use to independently understand that? And then the next question might be, assuming they understood that, what reactions do you think they would have to their understanding and other people would have to being told of their understanding? And so you might build your way to so you're giving people smaller steps in the questions is really what you're doing. And so that keeps them from giving you an emotional reaction
Okay.
or a precognated answer
Yeah.
because you're making them show their work.
That makes sense. So are the questions as you're working them out, are they arranged in sort of
Yes,
a
100%.
developmental or hierarchical? Okay.
Absolutely. 100%.
Now we're giving away one of the secrets
No,
to anybody who's listening.
if there were 10 other people who started the exact same literary magazine, I'd be happy. Like again, the goal is for this to exist in the world in a way that um, refines, humanity. Eh, It becoming pop culture is the end goal, right? That's not the
Yeah,
solution.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, that's an elevation of pop culture, right? From
Yes.
within. And it's sort of like the what do they say in politics? If you don't like the way things are, you need to join on the inside so you can change it on the inside. I suppose we can say something similar with pop culture instead of like just looking down and saying, "Oh,
Well,
these kids and other people these days, just a bunch of we pick whatever old-fashioned word,
right.
nincompoops or uh
Well, so if you go to, I'm gonna might get this wrong. I think it was from Plato, this idea of how the media we consume should be controlled by the state
right,
because it
yeah.
creates the good citizen. I disagree with that because I don't necessarily trust the state to do that well. Um, but I do believe that the media we consume, it might not like nobody asks what kind of music Hitler was listening to, and they're like, Chopin, we should ban it.
Yeah.
Chopin makes genocidal maniacs. I think
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
stupid. But uh, the things that we are exposed to on a daily basis, um, they create a framework for the way we see our surroundings, right?
That's right. Yeah.
If you're surrounded by racist, uh, whatever material, e even if you're not directly racist, you're seeing situations through that lens of intent.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and so and so one of the things that I think good literature does, and I like to think we do, is that we are helping people to reframe the way they see a situation. And I'll give you a brief example because it's not in our magazine, but it's an easy example people can understand. If you ask the random person on the street, are you in favor of gun regulation or gun control? What they do is they have this pre-thought out thing that they got from some media source,
Right.
and they pull it off a shelf and they show it to you, right? And then you pull yours off your shelf and you show it to them. That's not a conversation. That's, you're an advertising rep, right? Uh, and so one of the things that
Who's not getting paid?
right, who's not getting paid. And
Yeah.
whether you're an advertising rep for the NRA or for a political candidate or for a religion or for an economic theory, you're still an advertising rep.
Right. Right.
That's not a conversation. And so the way that I think good literature, and I like to think we can change that, is we don't ask you about gun control. We say on another planet where it's not about you, here's the situation. And so it's a way for us to trick you into being in a conversation about a topic that you would no longer have a conversation about.
You think that there's some readers that's just not going to work with? I have in mind, excuse me, for example, the people outside of the United States who will bring up the First or the Second Amendment
Mhm.
in Canada or Britain or things like that, and then other people have to remind them that's only an American
Right.
thing,
Yeah.
or who are using racial classifications coming from America. So, you see people, not so much native Brits, but like Americans over in Britain telling people whose grandparents came from the Caribbean that they're African American.
Right.
So it
Or that they don't
obvious,
qualify for scholarships for African Americans because they're from Africa. They're
yeah.
not African Americans, right?
Well, and they're not Americans to begin
Right.
with because
Right.
they're Brits. But you do see a good bit of that given how much of a dominance America has in the worldwide cultural
Yeah, you
sphere
can't go
now.
anywhere in the world without buying a Coke. It's
Yeah.
everywhere.
So is there? I mean, are there some readers who just they're not going to be able to participate in these conversations, or do you think there's a possibility of slowly weaning them into the conversations?
So I think I've thought about this a bit. Uh, I think the win is not changing someone's opinion because
Okay.
first off, by changing someone's opinion, you are assuming that your opinion is correct. And unless we're talking about like, what makes rockets launch,
Yeah.
like it's it's not just a fact-based thing. I think the win is not changing opinions. The win is metacognition, right?
Okay.
Why do I think this? Um, why do I think that, and I'll go back to my earlier example, why do I think gun control is wrong, right? Is it because of my upbringing? Is it because of my culture? Is it because of the Constitution? Have I read the Constitution or have I read what people told me the Constitution said?
Right. Right.
Is it because I know someone who's been hurt by guns? Is it someone who I know has protected themselves by guns? And so I think the requisite step to changing your opinion is understanding the basis of your own opinion. And that is very rarely done. But I also think that's an easier thing to get at with people.
So is that like one of the what would the word be? Not subtext, but I don't want to say hidden agenda either because that sounds
Yeah,
too conspiracy theory-ish. But is that one of the goals for all these after dinner
it, it
conversation
is the goal. No,
projects?
it's not even
Okay.
a subtext. It is the text. So when you read something, when you read some good piece of literature, uh, for me, the goal is not that it's not that we're going to say like, you should do this or you should think this or this is right. If somebody submits a story to us where the answer is clear, there's no point
Okay.
in publishing it. We already know what to do, right?
Yeah.
And so we will only publish stories where two reasonably intelligent, reasonably thoughtful people can have two reasonably different conclusions, which both from their perspective could be correct.
Do you ever publish a story that meets that criterion by clearly advocating for one line, but in such a way where people could say, well, no, that's clearly wrong, or, and here's why, or
So there is a theory about that, and we have published a few things about that. And it's this idea. Actually, we published a story. It was called "Give the Robot the Impossible Job,"
okay.
and it was a robot that was a teacher whose job was to go to. And we don't just publish science fiction; just is the one that comes to my head. Uh, who parent in the future, their child was killing and skinning small animals and things like that. And they were
Okay.
worried that this was part of a psychopathy that was going to later turn into more overt violence as an adult. And so they bring the robot in, and the robot has, access to unlimited theories of education. And the
Hmm.
robot's theory of education for this, after talking with this child, was I'm going to continue to one up them until they're offended by my one upmanship. And so the robot is like, hey, there's a serial killer on the loose. Like, we should go kill the killer. And the kid's like, yeah, that's a great idea. That's what I've been wanting. And he's like, great. And when we catch the killer, we shouldn't just kill him because we need to create a warning. So we
Yeah.
should, skin him alive, but keep him alive. And the robot keeps making more and more offensive suggestions in earnest, seemingly in earnest, until the kid is like, that seems like a lot. Like, and he's like, why is it a lot? He's like, well, because, and then that becomes the tool to break down the reasoning and
Okay.
for the kid to sort of deprogram themselves.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so we've published stories that are a little bit like that. The difficulty is if you look at the book and movie Fight Club, um, some people might read that book or see that movie and think it's an
An
advert.
instruction manual.
Right, it's an
Yeah.
instruction manual for life. And in actuality, it's the exact opposite.
Yeah, yeah.
It's meant to be a warning for the foolishness of these goals and these things that we're doing about manhood. And so that's the problem with doing that kind of thing is the some people take it literally,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
But do the questions then help to contextualize that? They
They
unravel
can.
bits and
That's exactly what they're intended to do. Yeah, they're meant to unravel things and they're meant to they're really meant to draw out this metacognition and to create a forum for people to have that discussion, right?
yeah.
About, what is like, why do we punish people? Is it to serve as a warning to others? Is it to make society safe for the cheapest cost per dollar? Is it is it to punish people because somehow punishment is deserved for wrong action? Um, and so, and it's interesting because these are all the things that philosophers talk about,
Right.
but they often talk about them in ways that are so hypothetical. You want to just be like, hold on, like, I get it. Now tell me an example. And they're like, well, I don't know, like, an example. And you're like, no, 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 like literally tell me tell me an example of the thing you just spent 50 pages telling me about. Because if you can't tell me an example, I don't know what to do with this. And what are we
Yeah.
arguing about?
So that raises an interesting question. In philosophy, we often use thought experiments, and thought experiments are essentially stories
They
that
are.
they're pretty generic. They don't have an awful lot of character or
There's a lot of
plot, and
reasonable people in them as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
What
And
would the
and
reasonable
and and
person
they're
believe?
they're usually pretty short too. And,
Yeah.
and understandably so, right? Because
Yeah.
we're using them, like you said, to illustrate something to get people thinking about it. So on the one hand, you got thought experiments. On the other hand, you have actual robust narratives
Mhm.
that have philosophical implications, may involve people talking philosophy,
Yeah.
you know. Um, is so here's I'll put it to you this way, and this might be a badly formulated question. Is there a dividing line that we can draw between thought experiment and actual story, or is it just a continuum?
Dialogue. Dialogue
Okay.
I mean, and that, I don't mean to be flippant, but that's it, right? Like the only difference
Yeah,
between a
yeah.
thought experiment and a short story
Is
is
having some
is
dialogue in
yeah,
it.
the characters have names and they have a discussion and that's it,
And that could
right?
include like interior monologue.
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
That's
Like
yeah,
like I'm
I'd buy that.
I think of the example, and maybe this is too narrow of an example, but I think one of the things that Descartes, if I'm remembering back to my philosophy classes, he talks about a piece of wax and how
Oh
he's
yeah.
continually molding
Meditation
it and
too, yeah.
yeah, and he's continually molding it and changing it. Like that's a story, right?
Yeah.
I could very easily think of an example where someone is talking to a friend, arguing about a topic in a short story, and that this idea of the continual changing and observation of objects is relevant to the problem they're trying to solve or to the
Right,
argument
right.
that they're in. Um, and I think one of the nice things about doing it as a short story, and I'm of course very biased in this, is it allows you to get at those kind of conversations in a way where you're not reading three sentences in an hour, right?
Yeah, yeah.
You're sort of de-densifying that topic.
Yeah, that would work. It reminds me as well of another closely related thing. So, you think about Platonic dialogues, right? And um,
They drive me nuts,
people,
by the way.
well, people sometimes are like, we could put these on as plays. You got YouTube. Why don't you actually like have people talking with each other? And then you look at it and you're like, well, this would make some really boring
Yeah,
stuff because nobody ever moves. I mean, there is like the Phaedrus where they walk down past the plane trees to the
right.
river, but that's it. It's just, I mean, the symposium, they lay on couches and get drunk,
Well, and also the
Um,
other issue with the dialogue, and this is one of my frustrations with a lot of these sort of discussions that you see in philosophy, is one person is meant to just be the foil, right? Where it's like one of the characters is just like, I agree, I agree,
yeah.
yes,
Well,
you are a genius. And
to
it's
be
like,
fair, there's a lot of that in Plato, but there's also plenty of pushback and
sure. But
stuff
it's
like
also
that.
very orchestrated pushback, which is one of my frustrations. It's pushback to give the main character a springboard, right? It's not, and this is my frustration, I think, with a lot of TV shows. Like the main character seems to be the only one plotting and scheming, and everyone else just is like goes to standby mode, waiting for the plot and the scheme. And it doesn't like, everyone is plotting and scheming, and
Yeah,
so
yeah.
like the chess game is going from both directions. And I feel like in a lot of the dialogues, the chess game is not really going from both directions.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's
That's
just my rant.
One of the things I wanted to come back to as well. So you mentioned that a lot of the stories are sci-fi, and we've
Mhm.
we've used a couple sci-fi examples here. And I was looking, digging around on the site today, and I think I remember coming across something where it said, yeah, we do publish a lot of sci-fi stuff. I suppose that's kind of low-hanging fruit for
Yeah.
these things, but we're looking for other stuff as well. And if I remember right, um, romance was suggested
Mhm.
as one of those. So I'd like to hear why romance in particular, but what other genres would you
Yeah.
think lend themselves well to this? Like, I mean, the stories are a bit too short for like hard-boiled detective perhaps,
We've
but
done
I
some.
don't know.
We've
Okay.
done a few.
So
Uh,
so what's the range of other stuff that would
yeah. So right now, about half of what we publish is science fiction. My preference would be it was about 20 or 25%. I think the difficulty is that science fiction makes it very easy to just say, well, on another planet or in a dystopian future or in a whatever, and there's a new invention. Um, so it creates a sort of, you know, a god machine very easily to at the beginning and rather than at the end. Uh, but we've published westerns, we've published romance, we've published
yeah.
fantasy, we've published detectives. We published a great detective one maybe a year ago um, about, and it's, obviously you have to do things a little bit differently, but in this detective world, this detective is trying to solve a murder or, yeah, a murder. Um,
Yeah.
and the issue is there had previously been sort of a Hutu and a Tutsi situation where, there was a genocide on both sides
Okay.
and 20 years later, nobody liked anybody, but they still had to work together. Um, and their solution was not to sort of address the cultural, emotional trauma that these genocides caused. It was to basically give everyone a suppressor, and so that they
Okay.
wouldn't feel their emotions in the same way towards these people of the opposite thing. And the
Yeah,
detective
yeah.
story was about a person who had figured out a way to sort of create a suppressor to this suppressor. And so
Okay.
they weren't doing the killing, but they were unlocking the undealt with trauma from sort of generational genocide. And then as
That would
soon as you
likely lead
unlock
to
it,
killing. Yeah,
right, that
yeah.
that 100% chance, like the person looks around and they sort of realize, like, my God, I hate all of my coworkers, and they go on a shooting spree. And so the detective story was figuring out, and of course, the reason we liked it was not because of the detective story. We liked it because it gave us an opportunity to talk about the ways that people either set aside, sort of trauma for another day when they're
Right.
in a better
Yeah.
position for it, and and when you actually do it, and it also gives you an opportunity to look at different ways that people have dealt with these things, whether it's South African apartheid or whether it's the American experience with slavery. To what extent do you have a tribunal, and to what extent do you just tell people, like, look, if we can all just shut up and move on, everyone gets richer?
Yeah. Or gets entertained, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And so we have stories like that. We had a Western that we did that was about a train robbery. I will say this for anyone who is ever thinking about submitting, because we get so many science fiction stories, our bar for accepting them tends to be higher.
Oh, okay.
Where if you're submitting other genres, we might say like, well, this is a really interesting whatever.
Yeah.
It's not perfect, but my God, we've never published anything in this genre before, or we've never,
So if somebody wants to get themselves
yeah,
published, it's a good
you've got
strategy.
about a
Now,
20% better chance if you publish outside of the science fiction genre, just because it's so competitive in that genre.
why romance in particular? I mean, I kind
Oh,
of
for
I
sure.
could imagine some cool reasons why. I mean, dealing with sexuality, attraction, there's all sorts of ethical issues involved in how we
Sure.
date people.
So there are lots of great questions about. I mean, the simplest one is just about ideas of consent, but there are questions that you can come up with about, attraction, about why we're attracted to people, about what partners give us in a relationship that make it valuable or invaluable. You can talk about, uh, what aspects of your personality you're willing to give and not give up in order to be part of a successful whole. Um, is the whole only purpose of a relationship sort of a net gain, or is there something other than that? We published a
Yeah,
story
yeah.
just a little while ago. I think it came out this month. If not, it's coming out next month. Um, about a woman who was going through menopause who didn't have really an interest in sex anymore, just because of hormones in life. Uh,
Yeah.
and she told her husband, "Look, I of course want you to be happy. I want you to have this aspect of a relationship fulfilled. So why don't you get like a real doll or something like that?" Um, and 3 months later, she goes into his sort of the spare bedroom and finds not only has the guy taken the advice that she gave him and gotten sort of a 120-pound real life sex doll, um, but he got one that looks exactly like her from when she was 21 or 25 or
Oh,
whatever,
okay.
right? Like
Yeah.
he sent them photos of her to 3D scan, and then they generated the doll based on this. Um, and she's just terribly offended. She's terribly offended for him doing the very thing that she asked him to do. And his
Yeah.
argument is, he's like, "Do you understand that, like, even though we're in our 50s now, like, this is still the way I see you every day. This is still the way I love you every day." And so when I was getting a doll made, this is the doll that I got made, is the way I still see you every day when I look at you. Um, there's a lot of not just ethics, but there's a lot of philosophy and a lot of sort of humanity to unpack in that story,
Right,
right?
right.
Uh, so
So
yeah,
it,
I mean, there's a lot you can do.
so when we think of like romance novels along with like westerns, mercenary novels, we think of them
Sort of
as
genre fiction, yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And
yeah.
I actually remember a used bookstore I used to go to that specialized in those sorts of things.
Mhm.
And they were like constantly going off the shelf and constantly coming back
Yeah,
in because people don't read them typically more than once.
yeah,
What you're looking for is, we could say, like the cream at the top when it comes to those, because obviously you can find romance novels where people are thoughtful and deal with dilemmas like that, although that's not going to be most of it. And you could have a mercenary novel where they don't just go on and on about how this person was in the special forces and used this tech and then
right.
shot a million people, but where it's actually quite thoughtful as well. I mean, think about I suppose you could say Graham Greene's This Gun for Hire is an
Yeah,
early example of that, right? So the stories that you're proposing, you're not saying, yeah, give me, I don't know, fanfic of this particular thing. You're looking for something that really is going to raise philosophical
yeah. I mean,
ideas.
the thing that's hard for people to wrap their hand around is we have a genre. The genre is stories
Philosophical
that, yeah,
fiction.
philosophical fiction. It's just
Okay.
not on a bookshelf. And so
Yeah,
then when
yeah.
people say, "What's your genre?" we say everything, but really what we mean is one thing, right?
Yeah,
It's a
yeah.
unique situation. We actually require before you submit, we've got about a 5-minute video of me talking, uh, being like, before you submit, Like, have you read our magazine? Do you get that this is what we're looking for?
Yeah.
One of the ones that we get that we really try and get people with is the difference between a hard question and an ethical question, right? Like your dog is sick and throwing up every day and, is in pain. Some people won't put that dog down. Uh,
Right.
but it's because it's a hard thing to do, but you know what to do, right? And so people will sometimes be like, "Well, this is a really hard question for the read for the character," and we're like, it's a hard question, but it's not an ethical question. Um, you know,
Yeah. Yeah, that makes good sense. So philosophical fiction, if that's what we call what the genre is,
yeah,
uh, some overlap with this broad classification of speculative fiction, right?
for sure.
But it's not exactly the same thing, is it?
Uh,
Or is it?
yeah. So it's really hard when I try and put us in when I have to check boxes and they say, "What are you?"
Yeah.
I either have to check them all or I have to check none of them. What I will typically check is literary fiction, speculative fiction, and contemporary fiction. And
Okay.
sometimes I'll click sci-fi dystopia.
Okay.
Um, but that really is a very rough tool for explaining what we do.
So I want to be cognizant of your time. There is one question that I'm sure you've gotten before, but I'm not able to overcome the temptation of
Sure.
asking it, even though I suspect that the answer might be there isn't one. Did you ever have, like, at any point in this, a favorite story that was submitted that you can actually say, this one, I'm not necessarily saying it's the best, but it's my favorite. Is there anything like that for
Uh,
you or not?
yeah. So I don't know if I have a favorite, um, but I remember my first favorite.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
so so I like everyone who runs a literary magazine writes a little bit on the side or whatever. And I remember the first story that I read, that I was like, at some point everyone's a Mozart and everyone's a Salieri.
Okay.
The guy who's just smart enough to understand how smart someone else is.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and it was the first time I read something where I realized I was the Salieri in the story, where I'm like, not even on my best day, man. Not even
Yeah,
on my
yeah.
best day could I write this. And it was, we actually just republished it. I liked it so much. It was a Brahma's Endgame.
Okay.
And it was about the seventh or eighth story we published, maybe in like the second or third issue. Um, and it's about an online game, like a World of Warcraft kind of game that's a perpetual online game that exists even when you don't log in.
Okay.
Um, and a researcher said, and this is now 5 years ago, so this is before Chat GPT. A researcher said, "Hey, I work in the world of AI, um, and I was wondering, like, I need a way to test the software that I'm building. Can we just jam it into a character, and maybe they're just going to walk around and bump into walls, but could we just jam them in there? And that way I can, get my PhD and I can publish my paper." And so she jams the character in there. And the first one or two, walk around and they bump into walls and they mostly talk in gibberish. Uh, they didn't have the words of sort of large language models yet.
Right.
But as she's going through her PhD and she's figuring out why they're failing, she keeps injecting new ones in with new theories because it's a way to see how it actually interacts with humans. Because unlike in the real world, humans will try and interact with this avatar, not knowing it's not real. And so over a period of a decade, she's injected, like 100 of these avatars into this online game. And eventually the avatars get good enough that, they create gold, they mine, they trade, they talk with
Okay.
people, they mirror the conversations they see other people have, all the things that we now think of as like Chat GPT-ish. Um, and then the company comes to her and says, "Hey, just so you know, we're not making the money we're making anymore. We we're gonna shut down our servers and we're gonna close this thing down." And so she goes in as an avatar into the game and tells some of the last versions of these, you know, uh, bots, like, hey, I don't know if you're going to understand this, but I just want to tell you, like,
Things are coming to an
yeah,
end.
you're going to disappear. Like, basically, you're a toy in our world. You're a game in our world, and things are going to come to an end because we're getting tired of playing your game. Um, and the more sophisticated bots, the last half a dozen of them,
Yeah.
they and it's never clear, and this is where the genius of the story is. It's never clear if they're sentient or if they're sort of sophisticated. They realize, like, what would humans do in this situation? How would humans protect themselves? And so what they do is they collect all of their gold and they hire real humans to go get sort of nuclear codes and things like that.
Ooh.
And they pay them in sort of, in world gold, which has a conversion into real money,
Yeah.
and they create a kill switch, basically saying, like, look, every minute we're going to need to send something to this server to tell it not to release this virus and this information, right? They have sort of uh, uh, um, a Wikipedia amount of information on the government secrets they've collected now from these people they've been paying gold to. And so they tell the government, look, if you ever shut down if you shut down our server and it doesn't get this ping every minute, like, everyone's going to know bad stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the government, the company and the government have to go, the company and the lady have to go to the government and be like, look, we we've got a problem. Um, and so the government has all these issues and they try and kill the characters and they try and do all this stuff and there's a big end battle. And this is all in 6,000 words, which is what makes it even more
I was
genius.
going to say this is a very
Phenomenal.
complex
It's
story. Yeah.
phenomenal. Uh, and the avatars win the battle, and the government's like, okay, we'll, I guess, just we're gonna create a we're gonna put you on a shelf in a warehouse, with a power supply and a hookup to the internet, and a note that says never turn off computer. And that's their solution. And so these people have essentially protected their world
Yeah.
indefinitely, um, and continue to, and at least it's implied that they continue to iterate and evolve over time within this literally computer box sitting on a shelf. The part that's most amazing to me about this story is 3 years later, Ryan Reynolds comes out with a movie called Free Guy, which, if you haven't seen it, it's
No, I haven't.
phenomenal.
Okay.
And it is the exact story. It is
Interesting.
literally an avatar in the game who realizes he's in the game and starts playing the game with the real characters.
Okay.
Um, it's a great movie, and it was one of those
I mean,
things where this author came up with this idea 5 years before this $200 million blockbuster.
yeah. I mean, I don't think that originality is the be all and end all.
No,
It's
it
how you
isn't, for
handle
sure.
it, because I could think of, there was a Star Trek Next Generation
With
set of
Moriarty,
episodes. Exactly,
yep,
right? And
same thing happened.
they wind up in some like a cube or
Yep,
something. So,
yep.
yeah, yeah,
And so and again, if the story had been about a battle in a virtual world, we wouldn't
yeah,
have
yeah.
published it. But it's not about a battle in a virtual world. That's the tool to help us talk about, what does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be
Right,
sentient? What are the criteria by which we would judge these people? Um, is the approximation of human action and self-preservation enough to say, like, it doesn't matter if you're really thinking, you're doing everything thinking people do?
right. Yeah.
And it creates a lot of, this is actually the first sort of Descartes thing that we had, right? That I think, therefore I am. Um, and
Well, and Descartes talks about this in Discourses Part 5, right? Or the discourse rather,
yeah,
on method. How do you tell a human apart from a machine, apart from an
right.
animal, right?
And this is the Turing test. This is,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
and I think what the conclusion the story tended to come to, but of course the reader can draw their own conclusions, was, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it doesn't actually matter if it's a duck.
right. Yeah,
Um, uh, and again, you may agree, and again, it doesn't matter if you agree or disagree with it. It just provides the tool for you to have those thoughts.
yeah. So I do have one other question. I mean,
Sure.
we could talk for hours because there's so much to
I
ask about.
appreciate that.
But so the name, the title, right?
Uh-huh.
The conversation, okay, that part I totally get.
Hmm.
The after dinner,
Oh yeah.
what is that suggesting? I mean,
So
it
that's
makes
about
you
my
think
childhood.
automatically about dinner parties,
That's
right?
about my childhood, actually.
Okay.
So one of the things that used to happen in my household growing up is we'd have friends over or whatever, and we'd have dinner. There'd maybe be like, a couple of extra adults at the table that night. And the dinner was never usually the interesting part. The
Hmm.
interesting part for me as a kid is when the adults would go to the other room, whether it's the fireplace room or whatever, the living room or whatever. Uh, and they would just talk about adult stuff. Um, and as a kid watching on, 10 or 12 or 15, that became a really strong model for me of what conversations were supposed to look like,
Hmm.
right? They were
Okay.
supposed to look respectful. They were supposed to be fun. They were supposed to be thoughtful. They were supposed to be a give and take.
Yeah, yeah.
And they were supposed to, at the end of the day, provide some sort of maybe growth.
Yeah.
Uh, and so that's really where it came from, is I was trying to create an opportunity for those kinds of after dinner conversations to take place. And interestingly enough, and this is, I would love to say I planned this. I did not. I've since gotten a couple of emails now from people that have said, like, hey, I'm going to host one of your stories for a dinner party. Do you mind if I, make some Xerox copies or email them to my friends? And they're going to
Yeah.
basically have pre-dinner party homework. And we're going to have dinner and we'll hang out and we'll maybe have some wine and then we'll discuss your story. And so we're not having a book club. We're really having like a one-off dinner party book club,
Yeah,
if
that's
that makes
that is a
sense.
cool idea. I mean, it could
Yeah,
even be done with like snacks or
it
something
could
like
be.
that. I mean, there's all
Uh,
sorts of
yeah,
formats
so one of the things
possible.
that I hope we'll get into is both training people to do that and providing tools to better facilitate that, and
Okay.
maybe even allowing people in, libraries or other public spaces or coffee shops to do that. And so that, in 5 years, I would love to see, that you could go to our website and find 30 or 40 locations where these sort of things happen on a weekly basis or a
Wow.
monthly
Yeah.
basis.
That's a really cool idea. Yeah. I mean, you could do some virtually as well. Have
For
people,
sure.
they've got snacks at home and
Yeah. And we've
yeah.
done that. I did that. We did that every week for about 6 months. The
Okay.
issue with it was, um, one, people aren't as nice virtually as they are in person.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Additionally, when you get about 10 or 12 people on a Zoom call, you don't always get the subtle glances and cues that say,
Right.
like, hey, it's my turn to talk now. I have something to say. And so
Yeah.
there's a lot of like hand raising that has to go on just by nature of the technology.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get us into an entire other conversation, but that's something that those of us who do a lot of conferences and events are trying to figure out how do we get some of those elements of face-to-face interactions that we enjoy into virtual environments. And the answer, at least at this point, seems to be not much.
Right.
There's things you can do,
You,
sometimes they work, sometimes they don't,
yeah, it needs to be a more structured conversation.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's really hard to keep people from stepping on each other.
That's why when Discord was first coming out and people were inviting me to philosophy discords, I just could not get into them because it was
Yeah,
just like people talking back and forth, and there didn't seem to be any
yeah.
thread or point to the conversation,
The internet doesn't
So
always encourage the best quality conversations.
that's true. Yeah. Well,
Social
is
media
there
doesn't.
is there anything else that you'd like to bring up or highlight? I mean, you should definitely like plug any link that you want to.
So the thing I would say is, so we're available everywhere because we're on a mission. We're very mission driven. Of course, I'd love it for people to come to our website and subscribe to our magazine, both print or digital. You can get them on Amazon, Barnes and Noble online, Kobo, all that. But I will say, if you're just trying to dip your toe in the water, we have a Substack that we do where we send out one story a week. We also have a free sample magazine on our website. And we also happily distribute through libraries. So if you have a digital library, we're on Overdrive, we're on Libby,
Okay.
and we still get paid. Like when you check something out in the library sends us like 40 cents. Uh, and so it's not like, you're stiffing the publisher on money when you go check
Yeah,
something in the
yeah.
library. And so, no, I would say, if you're someone who finds this sort of stuff interesting, whether it's with, your friends, your family, your kids, whatever, there are very low barrier to entry ways to find out if we're a good fit for you.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank
And
you.
this has been a great conversation. And maybe we'll have some more down the line in the future, particularly as new things roll out for after dinner conversation.
Oh my
So
gosh, can I tell you the one thing that we're trying to do right now? Because we're always
absolutely,
like we're
yeah,
always brainstorming ways. You
yeah.
ever seen those like card packets where you buy on like where it's like, 100 questions to ask a date or 100 questions
Oh,
with your
yeah, yeah.
family or mom. So one of the things we've been trying to figure out lately is how to partner with somebody who does that
Okay,
and do like an after dinner conversation branded version of those flashcards that have maybe a little bit more um, sophisticated questions that are on those flashcards. So instead of going through 30 flashcards, in 10
yeah.
minutes, you might go through 3 flashcards in an hour.
But it would require that people read the stories,
It
right?
might
In
be,
order to make
but I think
sense.
I think what we would do is I think on one side of the flashcard we'd put like a 2 to 3 sentence summary of the story,
Okay,
like a
yeah, that
very
might
dense
work.
summary with a question on the back.
That is a very cool idea.
Yeah. So we'll see if that pans out, but that's the thing lately we've been working on.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, Colby, thanks for joining me for this. And actually a subscriber to the Substack,
Oh, cool.
not to the other stuff yet, but maybe I'll shell out for it.
I
So,
appreciate it. We would appreciate it. We all work really hard on it.
all right,
Hey, thank you. You have a great day.
you too.